Well, and shares in African Bank fell nearly 4% after the unsecured lender flagged as much as a 28% decline in half-year profit. Now, Patrice Rousseau, who is head of equities at Sanlam Investments, helps us now to look at the unsecured space. Good evening, Patrice. Perhaps just an overview there of transaction they reported this morning, and the Able News is a little older. Just to look at a couple of those numbers, you know, it's a growing company. It's only been listed for a year. Mark Lamberti, of course, coming in from mass retailing into unsecured mass lending, I suppose, is where he wants to end up. Income up 21% to 2.5 billion, gives an idea of the scope of the country. Non-interest plus 16%, loans and advances up 27%. This is a strong growth story?
Yeah, it's quite a strong growth story. It's not entirely in unsecured lending. Their brand, their Bayport, is quite a well-known player in that space, but they're small. They've only got, I think they mentioned 3% market share, and they've been growing at 40% per annum. Really quite niched in terms of the area of the business where they focus. But that's only a part of their business. They're also into taxi financing, which is a very interesting space, a little very different space, whereby they're financing Toyota taxis, and seems to have done quite well there in terms of that business model. So it's interesting. It's a bit of unsecured and asset-backed lending with some other services such as payment services, whereby they provide, for instance, ATM services in the rural areas. So I think it's a very different proposition from your sort of core monoline unsecured lender.
Patrice, you say asset-backed. I presume you're talking about the taxis there. Some of those assets are a bit shaky and fragile and perhaps rather battered. But yes, they are assets. And what they do say in their announcement too, they talk about refurbishment of taxis. So this is not just lending money, it's enhancing the assets as well. But Wayne's got a question for you.
Yeah, Patrice, Wayne, yeah. When you look at their business model, I mean, Capitec came on the market when everyone else was going bankrupt, and we had the whole Unified debacle at ABSA, and everyone said, how on earth can this be successful? And they were incredibly successful. Do you think Transactions Capital's business model or their product lines differentiates them hugely from the other unsecured lenders in the market that will maybe give them some sort of competitive edge? Because, you know, when you look at their results, I mean, you know, the growth was good, the net interest income was good. They had to take some bad debt write-offs. I think the bad debts were up 40 or 50%, but that's part of the business model. Do you think they're doing something different, really different?
Yeah, I think, Wayne, I think it's a good question. As opposed to the others who I would say are more focused in the unsecured lending, they're a bit more diversified, given the fact that they've got a taxi finance, you know, credit services and payment services. So I think it's slightly more diversified than the other businesses. They've got also some counter-cyclical operations, like the debt collection business, where they're buying books of distressed debt and collecting those. So I think it's a lot more diversified proposition than let's say Capitec or African Bank, and it's very niched. So I don't think that it's as mainstream as the other players. So very few people would have heard of Bayport. You know, they would be in the downtown areas of, you know, some of the big cities and in one or two of the sort of more rural areas, but it's definitely not as mainstream as Capitec or even African Bank, which you see it by each taxi rank, really.
Patrice, another interesting number there was, and you comment first and then Wayne can comment on it. They say that 94% of South Africans do not have home loans. In other words, unsecured lending is a very important thing for South Africans because so few relatively have the house or the property, which is almost always the asset. You mentioned the taxis now. To back them, that's a number which seems to come at you, doesn't it? 94% don't have home loans.
Yes, I mean, definitely, especially after the credit crunch, you know, credit criteria have definitely been tightened, and it's been very hard for people to sort of gain access to normal secured bank credit. So unsecured lending has been an avenue for people to borrow, and there's nothing wrong with unsecured lending as such, as long as it's done within the parameters that the borrower can afford it. And I think that's the big proviso here. So if it's done within the parameters of a certain amount of disposable income, I think that's perfectly reasonable. The problem is there's been acute competition, and you've seen things like consolidation loans, extension of term, and that makes you wonder whether there's just not just been a fight for the customer, and lenders have been falling over themselves to try to extend bigger and bigger loans and at longer and longer terms, and not really thinking about whether the borrower could afford the repayment.
Well, this sounds like Europe, borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and never having to pay back.
Yes, we had subprime, of course, not that long ago.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Patrice. He's head of equities at Sanlam Investments.